Thank you very much, Amador, for this kind and generous introduction. And it's a great pleasure for me to be with you here today. I remember vividly the conference that was hosted in my country some years ago, and how I had the privilege as president to welcome you to the presidential residence, where we had what I called a discussion dinner or lunch, a discussion lunch, where the emphasis was more on the discussion rather than on the lunch. And I think it brought out the great spirit of this institution of encouraging people to think in a new way and to look at the world constructively. It has been decided jointly by me and the leadership of the Institute that I would talk about smart power and soft power in the 21st century and give you some examples from the history of my own country and my presidency as an evidence that the vision or the theory that I'm going to advocate to you actually fits political reality. But let me perhaps, in the light of the discussion in the previous session, start by bringing to your attention some fundamental aspects of how not only Europe, but also other parts of the world have evolved in recent years, because I fundamentally believe, and to some extent, if I may say so with full respect, that was also evident in the previous discussion, we have an outdated roadmap as a guideline. Generally, when we talk about diplomacy and the relationship between states, we are still influenced by looking at the financial strength, the size and the dominance, the military power, and the general effect that these entities can have on world affairs. I was reminded about this just earlier this week when I attended a conference organized by Google in Britain, where the former president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, entered a dialogue on Europe and Brexit and other issues that were also discussed in the previous session. And it was absolutely clear in his argument that whereas the raison d'etre of the European Union in its foundation and early on was, first of all, peace in Europe and the integration of markets, the rule of law and human rights, his argument was now primarily about power, that Europe would not have power unless all these countries stuck together, because otherwise China and the United States would have the power. And this reminded me once again of the forgetfulness, not only in political dialogue, but also in the media and current analysis, that if we look at the transformation which has taken place primarily in the world in the last 20, 30, or 40 years, it is for the first time in human history the increase and the creation of small and medium-sized states. Even tiny states. My own country, Iceland, was for the first few decades of the history of the United Nations the smallest country in the United Nations. There are now many more, much smaller than we are. And if we look at Europe, and I often remind my European colleagues of this, what is the most significant transformation in Europe in the last 20 and 25 years? It's not the Eurozone. It's not what happens in Brussels. It is the fact that for the first time in European history, we have a multitude of small and medium-sized states in Europe. In fact, in the composition of the European Union or even of NATO, the majority of the member states are small and medium-sized new European states. If we look at the rest of the world, and I will give you an example from the Pacific, where there is a multitude of very small island states, some of them much smaller than my own country, some of them with population under 100,000 people. But if we look at the ocean territory, which they control under the international law of the sea, and we add together the economic zone, the ocean territory, which 10 of the smallest Pacific island states control. And the total population of these countries is less than 1 million when we add it all up. The size of the ocean territory that these 10 tiny countries control together is bigger than the economic zone of Russia, China, and the United States combined. So we have 10 of the smallest island countries in the world contracting a sovereign right over a bigger part of the ocean than these 3 so-called powerful countries, United States, Russia, and Europe. If you look at Africa, another example, we see a multitude of small and medium-sized countries in Africa. If you look at the Middle East, we also see the sometimes dramatic and tragic fate of small and medium-sized countries in the Middle East. So my first message here today is to emphasize very strongly that we now live in an era, which is the first era in human history, where small and medium-sized countries form a majority of the states and the nations. And those that are classified as large countries and so-called powerful countries compose a small minority. So therefore, our analysis of diplomacy and interstate and international relations in the 21st century has to take into account this fundamental transformation. The second transformation, of course, which we should take into account, is the empowerment brought about by the change in information technology, by the fact that each and every one of you in this room is your own media company. You can, in fact, record my speech on your phone and then broadcast it all over the world by the time I finish. And there is, in fact, nothing I can do about it. So we don't have to rely on CNN, BBC, the state broadcasting systems in some of our countries, or on Reuters and Bloomberg and all the other powerful media companies, because we now live in a world where each and every human being with a mobile phone can be a political actor on a scale unthinkable 20 years ago, even 15 years ago. I sometimes say to people, in the light of the fundamental discussion recently about how Facebook influenced the election in the United States and in fact also in my own country last year. If you have not watched the movie Social Network, which is about the creation of Facebook, about this guy who was in his university and together with his friends wanted to create a new software in order to meet girls. That was basically the purpose of the exercise. Or if you have seen the movie, see it again. And then throughout the entire movie, think about the year when it takes place. We were well into the 21st century when the movie takes place. These companies that are now fundamentally transforming and empowering people all over the world are less than 20, 25 years old. And we are only beginning to see the transformation of this technological shift. I was in the Faroe Islands last week on a forum on the Arctic. The Faroe Islands are a tiny community in the middle of the Atlantic, 50,000 people on a number of islands far away from everybody else. They have now a better connectivity better internet service, better telephone connection than you have in the middle of Manhattan in New York. They have more possibility in a community of 20 people to become active political players than the people who are sitting in high-range offices in the skyscraper jungle in New York. There's a student from Greenland studying in Copenhagen. And Greenland, as you might know, is this big country full of ice between Canada and Europe. It's half the size of Western Europe. Half the size of Western Europe. Again, only with 50,000 people. And this girl in her early 20s sits in Copenhagen and creates video messages, which she sends out to every community in Greenland. She has now become politically more influential than most of the so-called elected representatives in Greenland through this technology, through her smart use of creating web broadcasts that she can then transport to every community in Greenland. I could go on long into the night to give you examples of this transformation, which has not yet reached up to the level of diplomatic, powerful country-dominated dialogue. And of course, the question of Europe is a perfect example of how this dominating orthodox dialogue misses the point completely. And that is my third message here in the beginning, that another aspect we have inherited from the previous decades is the power of orthodoxy, or what I sometimes call the power of the herd instinct, where everybody has to speak like everybody else. And if you voice a different opinion, you become an outsider. And these big institutions, whether it is the institutions in Brussels, or whether they are in Washington, or whether they are somewhere else, they have an extraordinary capacity of collective forgetfulness. Not for collective memory, but a collective forgetfulness. Let's go back to Britain for a minute. How many of you remember what was the top priority policy of Tony Blair during his first term as Prime Minister? It was to take Britain into the Eurozone. That was his top policy in economic affairs during his first term. Now not only is Britain leaving the European Union, but the new government of Italy might also declare that they are taking Italy out of the Eurozone. It is, to some extent, one of the most difficult aspects of modern politics, that the collective interaction between big media companies, big international institutions, and big governments creates a kind of orthodoxy on some of the key issues, which are very difficult to break. And what is being done by smaller entities, whether there is this multitude of small and medium-sized countries, which I referred to before, or whether they are small communities or regional authorities, or even just a group of individuals, tends to be ignored in the bigger picture. So that is why what we have called here in this title, Smart Power, Soft Power, is becoming increasingly relevant. Soft because it's not backed up by any military or financial strength. It is soft simply because it's based on the brain power and the thinking and the democratic cooperation of a collection of individuals, whether they are a village or a town or a community or a small country. And it is smart because it uses the modern structures of information technology and connectivity to get that message across to others. And interestingly, we have, from the modern history of my own country, a number of examples of how this approach produces better results than the more old-fashioned orthodox consensus. Let me begin by the financial crisis. Some of you might remember that 10 years ago, the Icelandic banks collapsed, like banks collapsed in many other countries, and we suffered a deep financial crisis and downturn due to this, and for a number of months, even a few years, we were example number one of a failed financial state. And my good friend Dagmar Jónasson became a minister in the government that suddenly took office following the dramatic protests in the streets and outside the parliament. And in this small country, suffering this fundamental shock of a profound financial crisis, we were then met with a collective demand of every European government, including our Nordic friends, and of course the combined strength of the Brussels bureaucracy, that first of all we had to follow their economic advice of how to deal with this financial crisis, and secondly, the people of Iceland should have to shoulder the debt of a private bank that had been running operations in Britain and the Netherlands. And unless we obeyed, they would block the IMF program in order to help Iceland to reestablish our economy. And for a number of months, even more than a year, they did so in the governing board of the IMF. The combined voting power of the European Union was used to block the program for Iceland unless we agreed to these combined demands of how we should follow their advice in dealing with the collapse of the banking system and this profound financial crisis. But due to a number of reasons, which I'm not going to go into here in my opening speech, we didn't do so. First of all, we let the banks go bust. We let them go bankrupt. And I've often said in many discussions and meetings all over the world, why is it that in other economies the banks are deemed to be almost the holy churches of the modern economy, so they cannot go bankrupt? But airlines can go bankrupt, railways can go bankrupt, retail companies can go bankrupt. But somehow you have to do everything and let the people pay in order to keep the banks going. And the German and the French banks were kept going at the cost of the population of Greece, due to what was called the economic assistance for Greece, but was fundamentally a support for the German and the French banks. Secondly, we refused to introduce the severe austerity measures that they demanded. We tried to shield the poorest of the poor. We tried to shield the healthcare system and the educational system and the unemployed. But what is perhaps more important, when it came to agreeing this ultimate deal of the Icelandic people taking on their taxpayer burden for 20 or 30 years to pay back the debt of one private bank in Britain and the Netherlands, I put it to a referendum and the people voted no. And let me remind you, because that is another example of the herd instinct and the orthodoxy. Almost every expert and every governmental leader in Europe and every commissioner in Brussels told us that if I put it to a referendum and let the people decide, Iceland would be deemed to financial isolation for years and decades to come. Even one of our own experts said we would become the Cuba of the North. But the people had the democratic right through the Constitution to decide whether they would take on this burden, and they voted no, and they actually did so in a second referendum a year later. Then Britain and the Netherlands and the European Union decided to take us to the European Court, which is similar to the EFTA Court, which is similar to the European Court for Norway and Iceland, which are formally outside the European Union. Because they were so convinced that their orthodoxy was correct, that they took us to court. And despite the combined legal expertise of the British Treasury, the Dutch Treasury, and the Commission in Brussels, they lost on every account. We won the case legally, completely. And if you look at the Icelandic economy today, 10 years later, it's the most successful economy in Europe. It has an annual economic growth of 6 to 7%, unemployment about 1 to 2%, a very strong positive balance of payment, and an inflation around 1 or 2%. Of course, we still have problems, of course. We still have inequality in our system. But compared to many economies in Southern Europe, for example, it has been an extraordinary turnaround. And if you look at the history of what this small country did, against the combined will of every European government and the entire Commission in Brussels, the course of events turned out in such a way that they were democratically wrong, they were economically wrong, and they were judicially wrong. But the interesting thing is, and I've often said this to many European leaders, instead of sitting down and examining why were we so wrong, why was the combined wisdom of every European government in Brussels so wrong in the case of Iceland, and the people who exercised their smart will in this way turned out to be right, there's been a complete silence. And that is another aspect of this analysis between traditional way of looking at power and the smart and the soft power. The smart power is always willing to ask the questions. It's always willing to learn from experience. It's always willing to admit mistakes. But big institutions are not. The second example I want to give you is our relationship with China. 20 years ago, there were many people who were saying, you should try to punish China, you should not engage with China, you should simply criticize them if you met the leaders, but perhaps the best option would be not to meet the leaders at all. We decided to go another way. And through that process, we learned a very interesting lesson. We learned the lesson that when we engaged with the Chinese in a dialogue and discussion, whether it was with the president or the prime minister or a governor or a mayor or a party leader, their primary concern was to learn from us, not to force us to do something else, but they realized China was in the early stages of development. And it was very important for them to learn from others. It took me a while to realize this myself. And the moment I did so was in the third year of my presidency, when the health minister for China came to Iceland. And he spent 2 weeks with a big delegation. I was very suspicious. What the hell is this guy doing in my country for 2 weeks with a big delegation instead of being back home governing China? So when we had the meeting, I almost bluntly, because we are kind of straightforward people, as you probably realized from my speech up to now, I basically asked him that question. He gave a very interesting answer. He said, we have looked at almost every healthcare system in the world. And we realized that here in Iceland, you have built a healthcare system that reaches into every village, every farming community, and that is then linked to high-tech hospitals. So wherever you are in the country, whatever your economic position or wherever you live, you have a similar chance of being treated by the best doctors in the hospital. We in China have 600 million people living in rural communities. We cannot afford to build a healthcare system simply for Beijing and Shanghai and the big cities. We want to learn from you. And that brought home, which is perhaps the core of my message to you here today, that in the 21st century world of smart power and soft power, it does not matter whether you're representing 200 million people or 200,000, whether you have big armies or no army, whether you have a huge financial strength or you're relatively poor. What matters when you enter the meeting of other nations and other leaders is what do you have to say? What can you contribute? What have you done? What is the example of best practices that you can put forward? And one of the reasons why my country has reached this extraordinary level of cooperation with China is that we always put on the table areas and projects where we excelled. And a primary example of that is our urban geothermal heating system. When I was young, and Ögmundur was young also, most of Iceland was heated by oil and coal, imported oil and coal. We are now 100% a clean energy economy. And we have built an urban heating system based on our geothermal resources. China is very rich in low temperature geothermal resources. So they have the potential of replacing the coal-driven heating system in Chinese cities. It causes this extraordinary pollution with clean energy geothermal projects. When Jiang Zemin, the then president of China, came to Iceland in 2002, I took him to our most advanced geothermal power plant at that time. It was the first time in the 5,000 years history of China that the leadership had ever been to a geothermal power plant. But they were all engineers, and they were absolutely fascinated by what they saw. Since then, we have, in cooperation with Sinopec, which is the biggest energy company in China, the third biggest company in the world, started to build urban heating systems in one Chinese city after another. Now altogether 80 such urban heating systems, closing down the coal-driven heating system and thereby improving the health and the living standard and the well-being of the people. I could give you many other such examples. So if you ask yourself the question, how is it that a small nation of 350,000 people up there in the North Atlantic has this dynamic relationship with China? The answer is primarily smart power, smart solutions, smart offers. And we were smart enough to say to them 15 years ago, why don't we make a free trade agreement? In the beginning, it sounded almost a crazy idea. Why should China make a free trade agreement with Iceland? I mean, such a small market doesn't even fit into one suburb in Beijing. But they realized if China was going to become a global economic power, they had to gradually test out how to make free trade agreements with other countries. So 10 years later, we were the first country in Europe to make a free trade agreement with China. The European Union is still waiting, despite all its strength, all its power, all its bureaucracy in Brussels. Then Switzerland followed us. And these two small countries in Europe actually led the way in creating free trade agreements with China. My final example is the one my good friend Ögmundur mentioned in the beginning, the creation of a new cooperation platform in the Arctic. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Arctic. It is a big part of the planet, mostly ignored by the Western scientific world and the political world until the beginning of the 20th century. That's why the so-called discoverers, the explorers from Canada, Norway, and others became so famous in the beginning of the 20th century, because they were the first people from Europe or North America to go into the deep Arctic, where indigenous people had lived for hundreds and hundreds of years. Then the Cold War closed it off because of the military tension between the Soviet Union and the Western powers, with military bases in Alaska, Greenland, Canada, Iceland, northern Russia, and elsewhere. So it's only in the last 20 or 30 years that we as human race, the nations on the planet, have had the opportunity to come together for a cooperation on this big part of the world, which is, if you add it all up, the size of Africa. The size of Africa. But the problem was some years ago that all the dialogue on this was limited to rather small gatherings, so 50 people, 100 people, 150 people, and they were very specialized. There was no multi-stakeholder gathering where the political leaders, economic leaders, scientists, diplomats, environmentalists, activists, indigenous people, everybody could come together for a dialogue and cooperation on what do we do with this big part of the planet. A big part which is also the front line, as you might know, of climate change, because the Arctic is warming faster than any other part of the world. The aggressive melting of the Arctic Sea ice is the major cause of extreme weather in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. And the melting of the Greenland ice sheet is the greatest threat to sea level rise everywhere in the world. So if only a quarter of the Greenland ice sheet melt, it will lead to more than 2 meters rise in sea levels everywhere in the world. And that is a world where a majority of people by the middle of this century will live in coastal cities. So this part of the planet has all of a sudden become a crucial area, not only for cooperation within that area, but also for the future of the planet. So we decided 5 years ago to create a new platform. Some people called it at the beginning a Davos of the Arctic, meaning a big gathering where all these multiple stakeholders could gather. But the difference was that ours was very open and democratic. It was an invitation to any gathering or institutions, whether it was a country like China, Korea, Russia, United States, whether it was a company, whether it was a research institution or university, whether it was an environmental organization like Greenpeace and the World Wildlife Fund, or whether it was the organization of indigenous people, they could all come there and hold sessions in their own name and decide the agenda and the speakers. Of course, they had to apply to us, but they had full sovereignty over their agenda and their speakers, which you don't have in almost all other such big international conferences, where there is a centralized authority that decides the agenda and the speakers. But we realize that in the 21st century, if you're going to be effective, you have to empower everybody. You have to empower everybody to come together and have the same right to speak their mind and contribute to the cooperation and dialogue as if you were a formal representative of a country. But we have all been trained at looking at the television screen, where people sit behind the names of countries, whether it is the Security Council or whether it's the UNESCO or whatever the institution does. We've all been trained that representation has to be based on your governmental authority. Those who sit behind the nameplate at the desk are the decision makers. That is, my dear friends, not going to work in the 21st century. We need a much more multidimensional, inclusive model, where everyone who has something to contribute, who is smart enough to have something new to say, and does it in a soft enough way to be effective, has the same right as the formal representative to speak. And unless cultural diplomacy takes account of that fundamental change, those who practice it are not going to be effective. And that is why I fundamentally believe that in the 21st century, we have entered an extraordinary new era where everyone can, in fact, be effective. And the examples that I have given you here in my relatively short introduction is an example of one of the smallest countries in Europe having a major impact through the financial crisis, through the relationship with China, and through the creation of a new framework for cooperation on a big part of the planet. These are all big issues. The financial crisis, the relationship with China, the future of the Arctic and the climate of the planet. And if a small country like mine can do it on these three big platforms, imagine what can be done where the odds are not as high against success as they were in our case. Thank you very much.